Thank you. In my presentation, I will focus on one of the civil society movements, faith-based movements in Turkey, but it's just a case study. There are several other similar movements in Turkey. I'll start with the Ottoman Empire to give you a background information about Islamic law, operation of Islamic law in society, also at a state level. And then I will move on to the Kemalist era in early 1920s, 30s, to show you how Islamic law has been stigmatized and even criminalized. So it had to go to the underground and operate as an unofficial, illegal law. As you all know, of course, Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual empire. It was, of course, collapsing for the last 200-300 years of its life. And when it lost the First World War, it was totally disintegrated. And even today's Turkey, Anatolia was invaded by different powers. Western Turkey was invaded by Greece. Southern Turkey was invaded by Italy. France occupied certain parts and so on, and the Ottoman Empire had to sign a treaty with the Western powers, which is called Sevr Treaty. It disintegrated today's Turkey as well, and Turkey had a landlocked territory in central Anatolia, 1/10 of the size of today's Turkey, stripped of Istanbul and other places. So in the national psyche, this is called Sevr syndrome, meaning that the Westerners are after dividing Turkey and ruling Turkey, separating it into parts, creating a Kurdistan and so on. So in all sorts of different polls, majority of the people would tell you that that's a fact. This is what European Union is about. This is what the Western policies are about and so on. Anyway, the young Turks of the Ottoman Empire, who were the educated, westernized, secularized elite of Turkey, who were sent to the West to get the scientific information, to get the knowledge with regards to engineering, knowledge with regards to warfare and so on, so that the Ottomans could compete against the Western powers. They took over the state after a coup in 1908, and they started ruling the empire until its demise in 1918. So these young Turks, who were the secular nationalist elite and rulers of Turkey, believed that there were two main reasons of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. First, Islam's backwardness, and second, heterogeneity of the empire. So their solution was to create a homogeneous, secular Turkish nation state. But in the lands that they inherited from the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, there were about 13 million people, but maybe only 40% of them were ethnically, linguistically Turkish. About 20% of them were Kurdish, who did not speak Turkish. About 15% of them were Alevis, who were not Sunnis. There were half of Istanbul were non-Muslims and so on. So they resorted to top-down imposition, social engineering, to create a homogeneous nation. So Turkey had its army and the state first. They didn't have a nation, so they started to create their nation. This nation would be, as I said, a Turkish Sunni secular nation. And its others, of course, were non-Muslims, Kurds, Alevis, and also practicing Muslims. They tried to create a new human type, a new favorable, palatable citizen type, what I call Homo lastus. Last here refers, this is an acronym, refers to laicist, Atatürkist, Sunni Muslim, and Turk. In order to be the best citizen, favored citizen in the eyes of the state, you had to meet all these four criteria. Laicist person, Atatürkist person, Sunni person, and Turkish person. If you were a Kurd or a leftist or a liberal or a non-Muslim or a practicing Muslim, you wouldn't be qualified. You couldn't be a soldier, a prosecutor, a police officer, intelligence officer, diplomat, whatever. You would always be discriminated against. And also through the ideological apparatuses of the state, in addition to the repressive apparatuses, the state tried to assimilate all these identities and by stigmatizing them. Alevis were represented in stigmatized ways. Non-Muslims, they were crusaders, whatever, or the ones who were Turkish nationals, they were suspect, puppets of the West, fifth column, whatever. Kurds, they were denied to speak their language, and it was banned and even criminalized. Same thing for Islamic law. Turkey received Islamic a secular civil law from Switzerland in 1926. So all Islamic norms and rules and regulations with regards to these liminal issues, life cycle issues such as marriage, divorce, and so on, they were all completely secularized for the first time in the Muslim world. But what happened was that in practice, all these attempts did not work fully. So Kurds remained as Kurds, maybe some of them were assimilated, Alevis remained as Alevis, many non-Muslims migrated because of all sorts of different oppression, pogroms, and so on. And practicing Muslims, they remained in Turkey. 60-70% of Turkish society still classify themselves, identify themselves as practicing Muslims. So what happened was that Islamic law was banned, it was criminalized, so in the public sphere, it was a criminal act to refer to Islam, saying that, look, if we do this according to Quran or Sunnah or Islam, our society will be better. We should have this sort of Islamic education. I mean, referring to Islam in any way with regards to social and political issues was not only stigmatized, it was also criminalized. And political parties who would argue these things would be shut down by the constitution, and Turkish criminal code made arrangements for these individuals to be imprisoned. But at a societal level, especially in rural areas, Islamic law continued to operate. So people created their own hybrid legal systems, unofficial legal systems. So many of them were simply paying their respects on the paper to the official law, but in actual practice, they believed that it is actually the Islamic law that matters. So many couples, for instance, got married with an official law, but they did not solemnize their marriage until they got the imam marriage, nikah marriage. So in the eyes of society, Islamic law was always superior. And the state turned a blind eye to it. And every 10 years, they enacted this amnesty laws. Okay, we are forgiving you. You might have some kids and children, whatever marriages unofficial. We will simply celebrate this officially as well, so you are forgiven. So this has been the operation of society. And many Islamic groups, especially after 1950, when Turkey was threatened by Stalin and decided to join the NATO, one precondition, unspoken precondition, was that Turkey had to have a multi-party political system. With the multi-party political system, all these subalterns, all these submerged or the underground Islamic groups came to the surface. They never disappeared actually, but they were simply keeping a low profile. All these Islamic brotherhoods, Sufi brotherhoods, Islamist groups, and others, they came to the surface. They started publishing their newspapers, books, and so on. And one of these groups is Gülen movement. It originated from the writings of Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, who was an Ottoman Islamic scholar, and who believed that Islamism is wrong. Imposing Islam from the top is wrong. It would create hypocrites. And also he argued that Quran is not primarily a law book. It's not a code. It is about ethics, morality, and much more importantly, he argued that Quran is actually a twin brother or sister of the universe. So universe interprets Quran, he said, and Quran interprets universe. And he said that because these two books, Quran and universe, are written by the same author, God, they cannot contradict each other. So he talked about all these laws of physics and other things, and he said studying the universe is an act of worship as well. So following in his footsteps, Gülen, who was a preacher and a bureaucrat in the state, in order to be imam in Turkey, because you had to be a bureaucrat of the state. So being a private imam is not possible. You cannot preach Islam unofficially. You have to be a servant of the state, and all mosques in Turkey, 85,000 of them, belong to the state, and all imams in Turkey, more than 100,000, they're all state officials. So he was also a state official, a preacher, but also he had his own agenda and Islamic identity as an Islamic scholar. So what he did was, following in the footsteps of Nursi, he argued that secular education is also Islamic. So what we will do, we will teach our kids physics, astronomy, biology, and so on, and they will be doctors, they will be astronauts, engineers, and so on. And spending money for this, giving donations, zakat, for this is also an act of worship. So you don't have to go and build a mosque or just open a Quranic literary course to be loved by God. So if you spend your money, your zakat, your charity for these secular initiatives, you are also serving God's way. So he convinced and mobilized many people, especially rich people, businessmen in Anatolian towns. And with this social capital, these people trusted each other a lot. So the movement was very effective, very influential. And because they were establishing secular schools, this appealed to the subaltern people who were discriminated by the state. So until very recently, for instance, one couldn't enter a university as a student if they wore a headscarf. It was banned. So they said, okay, you have to open your head and not wear a headscarf, otherwise you cannot get a university education, let alone going to a state high school or private high school. For the younger kids, it was forbidden anyway. And I remember from my childhood that when I was at the age of 7, 8, whatever, I was going to a state primary school, elementary school, and in our school, all teachers, women teachers, none of them actually wore a headscarf, but we always had one public servant or public civil bureaucrat who was a salaried staff of the state who was allowed to wear a headscarf. And this was the janitor lady, cleaning lady. So in our young brains, in addition to the movies, in addition to the media, headscarf people, religious people, similar to the non-Muslims, Alevis, Kurds, and so on, they were always depicted as second class, as subhumans, who did not actually deserve democracy, pluralism, human rights, and so on, unless they assimilated themselves into homolastus identity. They would always stay as second class. This was, of course, not on the paper, not in the laws, but in practice. So the state would simply search the secret identities of the bureaucrats in the army, for instance, and if they discovered that these guys are not drinking wine, or if their wives are covering their head, or if they are saying their prayers secretly, they would be fired without any legal process. So these Anatolian conservative people, when they saw this opportunity that their kids would get a secular education, and then they could be engineers and so on, with an upward social mobility, they would also have a lifestyle similar to the white Turks, homolastus people. So hundreds of schools were opened by this businessmen, and their model was a little different. So they were, I would argue, philanthropists, but they were opening private companies, limited companies, in addition to some charities as well. But if you look at Turkish history, you will see that the state, the Ottoman Empire, always confiscated people's properties. So until Tanzimat of 1839, property was not sacred. It was not part of human rights in the Ottoman Empire. With the Western pressure in 1839, they said, okay, we will not simply confiscate your property. But still, this is embedded in Turkish political culture. And people are afraid the state could confiscate their properties. And it is easier to confiscate a charity in Turkey because the state argues that, look, this already belongs to the people. You haven't been in your taxes. This is for public good. So they just replace a few officials of the charity and suddenly it becomes state's charity. So these guys, instead of establishing charities, they established private companies to run these schools, dormitories, and so on. But these private limited companies were different from their own genuine businesses. So on the one hand, these businessmen had their own private companies and they were getting the profits for themselves. But for the philanthropic limited companies they established, even though on the paper all the profits belonged to them, they did not touch these monies. So with these money incomes, they simply established, they used them as seed capital. So they went to another city and in some cases to Africa, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union went to the Central Asia to establish new secular schools. And because these schools were secular, they were teaching English as well, so they appealed to the many people. And until it was crushed by the Erdogan government after 2014, until that time, the movement was operating in 170 countries. In Germany, there are several schools affiliated with the movement. They get their funding from the state. They have a secular education. Generally, Turkish immigrants or Turkish students go to these schools, but they teach German curriculum, and the German authorities, of course, inspect them, and they're happy. And there are similar schools in the United States, of course, in Africa, in Central Asia, and so on. So Gülen has been using Islamic law unofficially to convince these faithful to spend their money for this alternative paradigm, which is an alternative to the secularist oppressive regime. And inculcating them with the values that, look, as a practicing Muslim, you can also be a modern person, you can also be a successful engineer or doctor, and you can also practice your Islam. You don't have to go to a cave or have a beard or have a Kalashnikov, whatever, to be a good Muslim. And actually, by studying all these sciences, you will become a good Muslim because you are studying the other book of God, which is universe, following in the footsteps of Nursi. And he also operationalized some Islamic concepts and reinterpreted them and produced a new knowledge. For instance, Hijra is the Prophet's journey from Mecca to Medina, because he would be killed by the polytheists in Mecca, so he decided to have a secret journey to Medina. And it is this concept, Hijra is a very sacred concept. So he said that if you, as a university graduate, if you travel to Central Asia or Africa as a teacher to teach these impoverished people, then this is Hijra, and you will get your otherworldly benefits. God will be pleased with you, even though you are teaching secular subjects, mathematics, biology, whatever. So he simply reinterpreted this concept. And I explained how he reinterpreted zakat. Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So if you are rich, and definition of rich in Islam is that for a duration of 1 year, you own more than 80 grams of gold. I don't know. A few $1,000s, I would say. So this means that you have to give every year 2.5% of your wealth, not your income. So 2.5% of your wealth, you need to give it to the poor, to the orphans, to your poor relatives, and so on. So this is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, meaning that it is obligatory. You have to do it, otherwise it is a major sin. Of course, state doesn't impose it on you, but in your heart, you know that it is a sin. So you have to do it. So he said that zakat, you don't need to give it to the poor only. Of course, you do it. But 2.5% is actually for the greedy, for the meanest people. You need to be generous and give 5%, 10%, whatever you can give. And instead of giving it to the mosque or to the poor, just use it for more productive things, such as establishing a school, establishing a hospital, and other things, or giving scholarship to the students who get education at these secular schools. So he simply reinterpreted this concept of zakat. And also, similar to what the Second Vatican Council did in 1960s, he in a way sacralized human rights concepts. He is not alone in this endeavor. Of course, there were other Islamic scholars who talked about these issues, including Nursi and others in the Arab world. But he said that actually, if you look at the major purposes of Sharia Islamic law, which is maqasid, and this was conceptualized by earlier scholars in the 9th and 10th centuries, maqasid, major purposes of Islamic law, are the protection of life, protection of intellect, protection of family, protection of property, and so on. So he simply said that, look, this is human rights. So human rights are Islamic. So he sacralized this concept. And shura, the concept of shura, it's not exactly democracy, of course, it's something else. But he said that, look, there is nothing against in Quran and Sunnah against people making their own decisions and making their rulers accountable. Nothing. You cannot show anything. Even though history shows that Muslims generally preferred authoritarian regimes and dictators, they love their dictators. But if you look at the original sources, there is nothing suggesting that authoritarian regime is the best. It talks about accountability, it talks about honesty, it talks against corruption, and so on. So when Islamists were saying that joining the European Union is bad in 1980s and 90s, and European Union is a Christian club, he argued that actually Islamic values could be better practiced and lived in Western secular democracies, and he argued for an Anglo-Saxon democracy as well, saying that, look, as long as you can practice your Islam, you are not required to impose it on others. This is not an Islamic obligation. Creating hypocrites is not an Islamic obligation. So as long as you are allowed to practice your religion, this is more than enough. So this is an Islamic state. Actually, he was arguing that many European countries are Islamic states anyway, if you look at the values of Islam. So for this reason, until recently, the movement's followers, and they were in hundreds and thousands in Turkey, they published newspapers, and one of them, Zaman, it was shut down by the government a few years ago. It was the best-selling daily in Turkey, broadsheet, national quality newspaper, selling more than 1 million copies. In Turkey, in total, there are only 4 million newspapers are being sold each day, so 1 million copies was a lot. It was a sort of liberal daily newspaper, mainstream newspaper. So it became an official, influential force in Turkey. But because of the threats coming from the Kemalist army and Kemalist intellectuals, these homologous intellectuals who were thinking that they were losing their ground and the West was helping Islamists to Islamize their society, they were soft on them, all these green belt conspiracy theories and others, they were trying to stage a coup. And in 2007, many university professors, intellectuals, academics, journalists, and so on poured into the street with the placards saying that army to the job, to the mission, whatever, inviting army to stage another coup. And in Turkey, this was a regular exercise for the army. On a regular basis, every 10 years, they staged a coup. 1960, they executed the democratically elected prime minister. 1971, another coup. 1980, another coup. They imprisoned 600,000 people, detained and imprisoned and hanged several of them, 1980. And then they created a new constitution and then left the arena, political arena, to the politicians, because the trust in the Turkish army among the Turkish population is always more than 80%, sometimes 90%. So by dealing with collecting the garbage in the streets, collecting the taxes, dealing with economic issues, they did not want their image and respect to be tarnished. So after a few years, after correcting everything, creating a new constitution, they would allow politicians to run the country, but within a securitized environment. When I say securitized environment, I mean that the politicians couldn't decide anything about the Kurdish issue, anything about the Asian problem with the Greece, anything about the Cyprus issue. So all these high politics issues, securitized important issues, were left to the generals, National Security Council, and a constitutional organ of the state. So in 2007, the army interfered again when a former foreign minister and prime minister, Abdullah Gül, wanted to be a president, and at that time, Turkish parliament would elect, according to the constitution, with a simple majority, the president, but he had a problem. Even though he served as a prime minister and foreign minister for years, his wife wore a headscarf, and the army didn't like it. And at one night, in the middle of the night, on the website of the Turkish chief of staff, we call it e-coup, so electronic coup. They said that Turkish army will protect its secular, Turkey's secular nature, and it will do whatever it takes to protect. So everybody understood the message. But Erdogan, unlike the previous politicians, he did not back up. What he did was to call for an early elections. And in 2007, he increased his votes from 34 to 47. People didn't like the interference of the military at the time. So this was the time when the Gülen movement started cooperating very closely with the Islamists, former Islamists. But after a few years, the trouble started. So Erdogan, thinking that he no longer needs the European Union support, he can establish himself as a regional figure, as the leader of the Muslim world. He started talking against the European Union and so on. But the marriage between the movement and the Islamist government continued until 2012, and both made several mistakes against the secular intellectual journalists and so on. Many of these people were tried and so on. So the movement lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the population as well. So when the government started to fight against the movement, it found many supporters. And people did not actually care what was happening to them, because the government simply resorted to all framework of dividing Turkey between the good guys and the bad guys, the puppets of the West who were simply trying to implement this Sevres Treaty that the West was not successful in implementing in 1920s, creating a Kurdistan and dividing Turkey and so on. So initially in 2013, the government presented Gezi events, Gezi protests, similar to the umbrella protests, as an act of the Lufthansa Airways, because they argued that Lufthansa was jealous of Turkish Airlines. That's why Germans were behind this. And Erdogan said CIA is behind this, and American ambassador Turkey is behind this. So he called something interest lobby, implying Jewish conspiracy is behind this. So he explained away what was happening during Gezi events. So when he had a trouble with the movement as well, he said that, okay, with the Gezi they could not achieve this, Now they are using another puppet. And look at the schools of these guys. They never teach Islam. They always teach secular subjects, and they always employ CIA and MI6 bureaucrats. Look at their English language teachers all over the world. They are all spies and so on. And he successfully convinced everybody in Turkey by using this anti-Western conspiracy rhetoric. So as a result, the movement has been wiped out in Turkey. It doesn't have any schools or any institutions, any media organizations. They were all closed down. But it operates in several other countries. So what I tried to show here that there are all sorts of different underlying dynamics. Binary oppositions do not work in Turkey. The state decides to use Islam sometimes it tries to create its own version of Turkish state friend of Islam. On the other hand, you have civil society actors who sometimes want to work with the state if the political party is suitable for them, and sometimes they fight against the state. So it's a very complicated picture. And in all these political games, Islam is, of course, in addition to many other things, has been used. Islamic knowledge, history, nostalgias, and also injured psyche of the Turks, their inferiority complexes, and so on. All this intellectual, historical, cultural reservoir have been employed by different actors in Turkey. Thank you.